All right, we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Being Patient's Live Talk. And today I'm really excited to have music therapist Concetta Tomaino to speak with us about healing the brain and body with music. And Concetta is the executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function. So Concetta, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Nicholas.
So Concetta, you've been a music therapist for decades now. Can you tell us a little bit about, how you first got into the field and how you became interested in, how music, the benefits of music for people with neurological dysfunctions like dementia?
Sure. Well, I was in college, I was a pre-med student and had always been involved in sciences, but I also had studied music, played accordion when I was a kid, and played trumpet in high school. And when I was in college, I ended up being a double major in music performance and sciences because I wanted to take trumpet lessons with one of the professors. So I had to become a music major too. And then somewhere toward the end of my studies in college, I found out about the field of music therapy, which, was established in the United States in the 50s, but I was in college in the 70s, and there still weren't that many academic programs around that I could take part of. And I found that the music therapy program, the graduate degree in music therapy, had just started at NYU. And so I ended up doing my master's and then later my doctorate at NYU. But one of my first clinical placements in the mid-70s was in a nursing home. And that's when I had my first experience with people who had suffered strokes, who could somehow move better to music than they could in physical therapy. People with aphasia related to their stroke that could actually sing words and speak after singing better than they could do in traditional speech therapy. And of course, there were people with end stages of dementia who were seemingly non-responsive and didn't recognize anything about their environment or the people around them. And yet when I sang a familiar song, they not only came to life literally in the moment, but were able to sing the words. And so my geek head science background said, how could they possibly do that if their brain is so damaged and their memory is so impaired? What makes music so resilient in people's minds that they could recall words perfectly, even though they can't say who they are? And so that started me on my journey in the mid-70s to find out what we know about music in the brain. Can we use music more effectively to really address some of these functional aspects that are still available to people, even though they may have a neurologic type of problem? And then, of course, in 1980, I had the chance to start to work with Dr. Oliver Sacks at Beth Abraham when I became a full-time music therapist there after my graduation.
Right. And and you've had a long collaboration with Dr. Oliver Sacks, and you eventually co-founded Institute for Music and Neurologic Function with Dr. Oliver Sacks. Yeah, tell me a little bit about how, Dr. Sacks, how you collaborated with Dr. Sacks
Sure.
at Abraham.
Well, he was the staff neurologist at the facility where we were. And in fact, it was the facility where Awakenings had taken place. That was a book that he had written, and then eventually a film about that whole experience that came out in 1990, 1991. But his experience with music was in witnessing people who were immobile because of a post-encephalitic type of Parkinson's, who could come to life and actually become not only mobile, but gain physical function when music was played, even though they couldn't move of their own volition. I had already had experience with people with stroke and end stages of Alzheimer's disease. And when I found that he was very interested in music and had witnessed the influences of music therapy firsthand, within the first month that I was at Beth Abraham, he sought me out and we connected and we started talking about what is it about music that makes it so resilient and such a useful way of connecting to people who have these types of disabilities and impairments. And so for 35 years, we worked together to try to explore and explain and understand the dynamics of music and human function, not just music in the brain, but what is it about music that is so embedded in who we are as individuals? And then how can we use that in reaching people and helping them have the fullest life possible?
Right. And, you know, one of the things that you mentioned to me before in a previous conversation is, you know, how Dr. Sachs really, you know, when he was doing his exams with patients, like he was really, you know, focused on engaging the patient, right, and seeing the patient as a person, right. And I feel like music therapy must be, you know, like music therapy is really focused on that too, right, and engaging with the patient, right, and focusing on their abilities, right.
Right, absolutely. I mean, Dr. Sachs, Oliver, was so focused on who that individual was. He wasn't the typical doctor that just made an exam and gave a diagnosis and then the treatment. He really wanted to know who this person was and how that person could have as fulfilled a life as possible. Mm-hmm. And in music therapy, the individual is always at the center of everything we do. In fact, the definition of music therapy is working in that psychodynamic interaction between the therapist and the client to address whatever the goals are that that person needs, and understanding how music can help them reach those goals.
Right. And yeah, I want to speak a little bit about, you know, the science of music, and more specifically, you know, the science behind the benefits of music for patients with Alzheimer's. Like, what do we know is happening, like in their brains, and that's happening when, you know, they're going through music therapy? And yeah.
Sure. There's, you know, it's such a dynamic process. And I think scientists are still trying to identify all the different elements that are affected when we hear and interact with music. There's some things we know already. For example, the auditory system has connections, there's networks throughout the brain that are aroused and stimulated by patterns of sound, and that those patterns of sound can actually drive and stimulate motor function and attention. So we know that. We also know that we respond emotionally to certain types of sounds, and of course the music that we love and that we form attachments for and hold memories of become deeply embedded in the subcortical or stronger networks in our brain. They are still very well preserved. And so those emotional connections to a song that we love remain with us for quite a long time, up until the very end. And so when you think about music, you think about vibrations in the air, you think about the tone of the pitch of the music, you think about the notes coming together in harmony and the patterns of sound. It's very complex. And so to really understand exactly how each one of those things affect us neurologically is complex as well. So there's studies that look at the psychodynamic aspects of music interaction from a psychological point of view. They give us some answers about the importance of personalized music and interaction. And then there's some of the neuroscience studies that show us what happens in the brain when somebody responds to rhythm, or what happens, or what parts of the brain light up when a familiar song is heard. So we're starting to get glimpses of some of those impacts. And of course, there's more advanced studies going on now that look at some of those interactions in a way that help us explain it, and provide some efficacy for the importance of music as a therapy. But I don't want to lose the psychodynamic part of it too, because that's just as crucial.
Right. And the fact that like music just engages with so many different parts of our brain and body, right? From like,
exactly. Yeah, it's so much, you know, music is so much more resilient and well preserved than, say, a visual cue. You know, visual perception is a higher cognitive, higher cortical function. And so music allows some of these deeper, more I don't want to say simple, but lower parts of the brain, networks that are more robust and resilient, that is still very much functional, that can be stimulated with music. Even if the person can't recognize the song by name and they've lost those aspects of cognition, the sense of knowing and the sense of recognition is still very strong, and the emotional connections are still very strong. And that's one of the benefits of using personalized familiar music with people with neurocognitive deficits like Alzheimer's disease, because it allows us to reach those areas that are still functional and very well preserved.
Yeah, then let's talk about like what music therapy would entail for patients living with Alzheimer's, and like, can you run us through like what music therapists would offer for
Sure. It's really quite broad. Again, it depends on the individual. So in the early stages, say somebody's just been diagnosed with a neurocognitive deficits like Alzheimer's, and they're starting to become forgetful. We may not use familiar songs with that person in the beginning. We may find ways of allowing them to be creative and expressive, maybe write songs, maybe put together words to create lyrics and help them express themselves. And in doing so, actually build upon some memory skills, short-term memory skills, pairing of information. For example, we may have them not create songs, but find songs that they could connect with loved ones in the family. So when they can't recognize that person anymore, that song has already been associated with that person. And if that person visits, singing that song together will help the person with dementia recognize who that person is. So things like that could be done in early stages, or using music like a mnemonic tool, creating a little melody or rhythmic pattern to help somebody recall and memorize their phone number or address. So, using it more in a more directed way like that. As the person loses the ability to recognize loved ones, they're still able to express themselves. And so we may, and even in early stages, may do a lot of improvisation, and we may use percussion instruments. We may use melodic instruments like a keyboard and allow them to explore the sounds and create a soundscape with them. The main thing is to allow the individual to be as expressive as they can and to support that, and to see how it allows them to either deal with emotional issues or memory issues. And then, toward when the person starts losing physical function and balance and coordination, there's ways of using rhythmic patterns and rhythmic cueing of gait to help with balance and coordination and ability to move with more confidence. So those are things that may be done in music therapy as well. And then we work with care partners, family members, or staff of a facility to create playlists of the person's personalized music to help them connect when a music therapist isn't there. Or we may find music that can help the person relax if they get agitated. There's certain times of day when the person may be restless. So finding music that can help them feel safe and comfortable and be able to be calm.
Right. And how about like in the very later stages of Alzheimer's or other forms of, dementia,
Sure.
what role of music therapy?
Well, that's the amazing thing about music is even in the very, very last stages, people still respond as long as they still are able to hear and I won't say feel, but they can still hear the melody and still respond to that. There's still a way of engaging them and having them be part of that. We may even improvise sounds if the person is making sounds. We may reflect those and use that as a way of acknowledging them and bring them into a musical experience. And maybe it's not a song, maybe it is. but many times, and I've done research on this, even in the last stages, there's this sense of recognition. The only time music doesn't work, and this is where people need to be a little bit careful, is when people are diagnosed with frontal temporal dementia. And in those cases, sometimes the area of the brain that perceives the actual pitch of music is damaged. And so the person only hears noise. It's almost like static in a array or whatever, however their brain perceives that activity, can be very uncomfortable and disconcerting for a person. So if somebody wants to try music with their loved one and sees that the person is pulling away, it could be that they don't hear the music itself, it's noise. And then of course, music, because it's so personal to us and because it holds so many deep memories, there could be music that makes us feel wonderful, but there's also music that can make us feel very sad. And so one of the things that music therapists are trained to do is to, even if the music makes the person feel sad, allow, if it's appropriate, to allow them to express those feelings in a way that's meaningful. But to a caregiver that maybe doesn't understand what's going on, that may be too challenging. And so what we usually suggest is to try to avoid songs that may be too difficult for the person to listen to emotionally.
Right, got it. And how about for outside of music therapy? Like, do you have any suggestions of, how caregivers or people living with dementia themselves, of how they can, incorporate music into care or in
Sure. One of the wonderful things now, and especially after these past 2 years of COVID, we've learned how wonderful Zoom is and how connected we can be. There are so many music videos online that people can gain access to. So if you like, doo-wop music or Motown or, Frank Sinatra, whatever the music that you like to listen to, that's really available. And you should spend some time together each day to listen, maybe sing some of the songs. Definitely move to music. If you like to dance, put on some music. Being able to be mobile actually helps with delay issues with balance and coordination. So if there's a good upbeat song that you could play to do some exercise and movement, that's really great too. So there are resources online, and so many organizations now do some, and we have a Facebook Live program on Tuesday mornings, but there's other organizations, music organizations like some real established ones like Lincoln Center in New York that offer some programs online, especially geared for people with memory issues. And I'm sure there's ones in everybody's state as well. And of course, there's resources to find music therapists.
Right. And one of the ones, you mentioned there's a few that's good, right? And I'll just mention it here is cbmt.org, right? That's a good one for. That's
the certification board for music therapists. So cbmt.org. And on that site, people can actually search by their city and state to see where a board certified music therapist is located.
Right. And then musictherapy.org is another good one where people could look for more resources on music.
Right. So that's the American Music Therapy Association, and there they can also find if a music therapist is in their area or if there's a college program, because many times universities may have clinics and students who provide programs for the community. So they should look out for that as a resource.
Got it. And lastly, music and memory is also that's also a good resource.
So music and memory is a program where they train people who work in nursing homes, assisted living, to create personalized playlists. I'm on the board. I actually help with some of the advisement on that program. But people can also find resources on the website to help them identify songs that may be good to use with their loved one. And they can always reach out to us too at the Institute.
Got it. And for family members and people living with dementia, I was wondering, if they do want to seek a music therapist, is asking like their primary care doctor or their neurologists for referral? Is that like a good way to
Sure.
start, aside from the resources that we talked about?
Sure. And one of the exciting things is that more and more, depending on what state people live in, music therapy is reimbursable through some insurance companies. And many times, if it's referred by a physician or by maybe there's a case manager that they're working with, the referral to music therapy could be for a range of potential goals. So it could be for behavioral issues, it could be for psychodynamic type work, it could be for medical, actual physical type things to support physical therapy or speech therapy type goals. As long, it's not to replace those therapies, because obviously those are professions in and of them, but to support some of those goals. Even people with frontal temporal dementia, there may be ways that sound and other types of things could help with some of the behaviors. And we've had many neurologists refer people to us because of that. And then the family member or whoever the care partner is can actually see where, if their insurance company will reimburse it. In some states now, like in New York State, behavioral health is covered under Medicaid. So we're looking into advancing some of the services through that. In some states, music therapists throughout the United States are board certified, so they'll have a credential MTBC. But in many states, in New York State, for example, if you work in behavioral health, you have an LCAT, licensed creative arts therapist. And so other states may have other credentials that further show the professional nature of the music therapist.
And one thing I forgot to ask you about that you mentioned previously was so music therapists can also use music as a form of psychotherapy.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that is, and in music therapy, what does that entail, like using
Sure.
music as a form of psychotherapy?
Sure. Well, the depending on the individual, the session may be, like I said, an improvisation where the client may not be able to verbally express what they're feeling, or they may have some resistances to express maybe a fear or depression. But there's this wonderful thing that happens when somebody's creating music with the therapist, that they sort of go into this flow state, especially if that interaction, the music improvisation goes on for a while, and the person sort of loses a little inhibition and is able to express in a very deeper way some of the feelings that they may have been holding back. And it allows, if the person's able to verbally have a discussion with the therapist, there could be a verbal element of that. But many times it's within the music itself that the person is able to express themselves. They don't even have to be musical to do this, because the music therapist knows how to create a safe way for the person to sound good and make the music to allow that expression. So maybe percussion instruments, and maybe some types of melodic instruments, or different types of tonal
Right.
instruments.
Right, like even for people who haven't necessarily had experience with an instrument, musical instrument before, or haven't particularly enjoyed music before, music therapy could still be an avenue that they can explore.
Absolutely. And even for, we've done some in the music therapists work with the caregivers as well, because if anything, they have a lot of stress and things they need to take care of. So the care partner may actually look to see if there's support groups, music therapy support groups for them, that allow them to not only engage in music, but use music as a creative outlet, and help them deal with some of the issues they may have as well. Somehow sharing music with a lot of people is a way of breaking through some of those barriers to conversation.
Right. And, you mentioned how, music could be helpful for helping people like express themselves, right? Like, could it be helpful for like people who just receive a diagnosis and having a hard time really coping with this, life-altering diagnosis of dementia? Can music therapy like help people, express they're feeling at those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even holding on, allowing that person to be creative and expressive and validate who they are and their capacities, that remains, allowing that to happen. So even with this sense of, it's sometimes called ambiguous loss, when you get this diagnosis and it seems like your whole world is falling apart at that point, to be able to hold on and to have avenues of self-expression and self-validation is so important to maintain that as long as possible.
And how about like group-based music therapy? Are there group-based music?
Oh yeah. So there's wonderful programs, group-based. There's percussion programs, drumming programs that happen all over the country, and then also in several areas, and people should look into this. There's choirs for people who have memory issues and their loved ones or partners. And so they should look and see if there's a choir in their neighborhood that they could participate in. Those are very successful.
Right. And group-based therapy, I'm sure, comes with, the benefits of having, other people who are going through similar experiences, just being able to be in their company and engage in meaningful activity can be very important.
Absolutely.
Got it. Well, yeah, Concetta, is there anything else you'd like to add? Any final words? Yeah.
Only that people should really look to see if music therapy is available to them in their city, and to take advantage of really bringing music into their life. And I mean, I'm hoping it is a part of everybody's life, but to really find ways of using it with their loved ones and to make it a family affair, so they can maintain those relationships as long as possible and at a very strong level.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights, Concetta.
My pleasure.
And for our audience, if you've missed any parts of this live talk, we'll upload a recording to YouTube. And if you haven't signed up to our newsletter yet, don't forget to sign up on our website. Thank you all for joining. Bye.
Bye.